The scent of freshly cut grass used to calm me. It was the fragrance of summer Saturdays, of quiet mornings with the paper, of the soft thrum of a neighborhood pretending to be perfect. But not that morning. That morning, the scent turned bitter, like betrayal left too long in the sun. I stood at my front window, coffee cooling in my hand, staring at what had once been my sanctuary, a living wall of hedges, green and proud, that had stood guard over my property for more than 2 decades. They were not just shrubs. They were memory and time, patience and quiet dignity. I had planted them myself the year after Claire died, back when silence felt like a punishment, and digging into the earth gave me something to do with the grief. I watched them grow, inch by inch, season after season. They were thick and towering, a deep emerald barrier that gave me privacy, that kept the world out when the world became too much. For 20 years, they were the quiet companions of my solitude. They were mine, until she came, Brenda Carmichael. The name itself feels sour on the tongue. She moved into Cypress Creek 5 years ago and declared war on anything that dared stand in the way of her vision of community perfection. She rose quickly through the HOA ranks, buttering up retirees and bullying the rest. Now she was president, and she wore that title like a queen wore her crown, sharp, polished, and always 2 inches too tight. It started small. A note tucked under my windshield wiper. A friendly reminder that all greenery exceeding 7 feet must be trimmed to comply with HOA Regulation Section 4, B, Article 3. Your cooperation is appreciated. No name, of course. But the crisp linen paper and the lilac-scented ink gave her away. Brenda had a flair for passive aggression wrapped in scented envelopes. I tried to compromise. I trimmed a foot off, then another. The hedges stood at a respectable 8 feet. Still above regulation technically, but it was a good faith gesture. I thought it would be enough. I thought wrong. 2 days later, I received a certified letter. Formal violation. $50 fine per day until the offense was remedied. The letterhead was HOA Official. The signature at the bottom, Brenda Carmichael in her precise looping script. I could almost hear her rehearsing the lines in her mirror before signing it. I called the number listed just to talk, to reason. Cypress Creek HOA, came the voice on the line. Brenda Carmichael speaking. Of course. Brenda, I said, this is Arthur Vance. About the violation notice, a pause, then the sugar-slicked voice replied, yes, Mr. Vance. I do see your file here. Your hedges are still non-compliant. I trimmed them. They are down to 8 feet now. Well, she said with a delicate sigh, the bylaw states 7, not 8, not 9, and certainly not the 10-foot jungle you were previously cultivating. Jungle. She spoke about my hedges like they were criminals, like their existence was a rebellion against her suburban empire. Brenda, I said, trying to keep my tone civil, these hedges were here long before that bylaw existed. I planted them 20 years ago. They are established. They are healthy. They are mine. She responded without hesitation. The covenants apply to all residents, Mr. Vance, new and old. Equality, you understand? Then her voice dropped, as if we were conspiring. Besides, she added, they block the morning sun from my crimson glory roses. They need full sun, you know? That was it. That was the truth beneath all the legalese. It was not about regulations. It was about her roses, her control, her need to manicure the world into her image. Look, I said, my voice tightening, I am willing to trim another 6 inches, but anything more will damage them. These are mature plants. The rule is 7 feet, she said again. The HOA will take action if necessary. And then she hung up. No room for grace, no space for kindness. Just a clipped goodbye and the sharp edge of threat. I stood in my kitchen, the letter in one hand, the silent phone in the other. Outside, the hedges swayed slightly in the breeze, unaware of the war they had become part of. In that moment, I felt something I had not felt in years. Cornered. Not just by Brenda, but by a system that gave her power. A neighborhood that nodded politely, but never pushed back. A world where someone like her could rewrite the rules and no one would question her pen. But I was not 20 anymore. I was not the man who bowed just to keep the peace. Not this time. People have always mistaken my silence for weakness. Maybe it is the way I carry myself. Upright but never rigid, polite to a fault, never one to raise my voice in public. Or maybe it is the profession. Librarians are not known for confrontation. We speak softly, we shelve order into chaos, and we memorize the quiet. For the past 22 years, I have lived alone in this house on Hawthorne Lane. It is modest, a single story, with pale blue shutters and an aging maple out front. I bought it the year Claire passed, a choice born more from instinct than planning. Grief makes you crave the illusion of control, and the house offered that. Stable, quiet, unchanging. My routines became sacred. Coffee at 6, paper delivered by 6:15. Mondays were for vacuuming, Thursdays for grocery runs. I walked the perimeter of the hedges every evening, pruning stray twigs, inspecting for mites or browning leaves. They were more than landscaping. They were the last living thing I had nurtured with my own hands. Before I became a librarian, I spent 6 years as a high school English teacher. But the bureaucracy, the noise, the petty politics of the school board wore me down. When Claire got sick, I stepped away. After she was gone, I never stepped back in. I took a quiet position at the city archives and surrounded myself with records, manuscripts, the lives of people now forgotten. There, I found solace in dates and facts that did not argue or unravel. The neighbors barely knew me. They waved sometimes, brought over cookies that first Christmas. But Cypress Creek was not built for deep connections. It was built for surface harmony, identical shutters, uniform lawns, regulated welcome mats. Brenda thrived in that kind of world. I merely endured it, and yet I followed the rules. My trash bins never stayed out past pickup. My porch light was the approved wattage. My mailbox, HOA certified, the only variance, my Hedges, had been there long before Brenda and her clipboard arrived, which is why the fine stung more than it should have, $50 a day. The letter was written with the sort of bureaucratic smugness that masquerades as formality. It spoke of repeated non-compliance, community standards, and escalating penalties. My name was typed in bold. The signature below, Brenda Carmichael, neatly printed, no flourish, just power distilled into ink. I called the number on the letter, hoping for reason. I should have known better. Our conversation, if it could be called that, ended with her reminding me again of the bylaw, 7 feet, not a millimeter more. I tried to reason. I explained that I had trimmed the hedges already, that any more would risk damaging the root systems. I offered to bring in an arborist to confirm it. She was unmoved. "It is not about what is reasonable," she said flatly. "It is about what is written." The line went dead. I remember sitting at the kitchen table after that call, the letter spread before me, the clock ticking loud against the silence. $50 a day, $350 a week, almost $1,500 a month. It was not a fee, it was a punishment. I could have paid it, I suppose. I had savings. Claire and I were never extravagant people, but it was the principle. I was being fined for preserving something I had built with care, with intention, something that had harmed no one. I considered hiring a lawyer, but the cost, the time, the emotional drain. I knew where that road led. HOA disputes rarely end with dignity intact. They end in courtrooms or moving vans. So I chose the only thing I had ever relied on, compliance. I went out that weekend with my trimmers and removed another 6 inches. It broke my heart. Each cut felt like a betrayal, not of the HOA, but of myself. By Sunday evening, the hedges were just under 8 feet. Still technically in violation, but far from offensive. They looked neutered, exposed, as if their confidence had been shaved down alongside their height. I took photos, sent them to the HOA with a brief note. Adjusted per section 4B, Article 3. Please confirm, receipt no reply. Days passed. The silence stretched. I thought, foolishly, that perhaps I had done enough. That reason had triumphed. Then the second letter arrived. This one came via certified mail, the envelope thick with menace. It included the same fine. No acknowledgement of my trimming, no grace, only escalation. Brenda's name again, bold at the bottom. I called the number once more. This time, I was sent directly to voicemail. The recording was bright and chipper. Thank you for contacting Cypress Creek HOA. Our office hours are Monday through Thursday, 10 to 2. For urgent matters, please consult your community guidebook or email our team. Have a harmonious day. A harmonious day. I laughed out loud, the sound bitter in my empty kitchen. That night, I sat on my porch long after the sun had disappeared behind the rooftops. The hedges stood before me like soldiers cut down mid-battle, their tops unnaturally flat, their strength drained. I thought of Claire, of how she used to call them our secret keepers. She loved the privacy they offered, the way they cocooned the house in peace. And now, that peace had a price tag. I was not angry yet, not fully. I still believed in the power of logic. I still believed there was a middle ground, a way to coexist. But something had shifted. It was not just the letter, it was the tone, the presumption of guilt, the way she had dismissed me so easily, so coldly. It was not about Hedges, it was about being erased, about being told, without a word, that you do not matter. Brenda saw me as an inconvenience, a relic, a man who would fold rather than fight. And maybe once upon a time, she would have been right. But that night, as I stared at those wounded hedges, I felt the early stirrings of something unfamiliar. Not rage, not yet. But something colder, something harder. It happened on a Tuesday. Of all the days to be ambushed, it had to be the one I had always considered the most harmless. Tuesday was the quiet heart of the week. No Monday chaos, no midweek fatigue, just stillness, predictable, safe. I was halfway through a first edition copy of The Collected Works of Tennyson, the same volume I had handled in graduate school when the sound began. At first it was only a low mechanical growl, distant and benign. I barely looked up from the page, then the growl multiplied. One engine, then another, then a third, all coughing and snarling in unison, growing louder, closer, until the walls began to tremble with their anger. I rose, confused, pulled aside the curtain. What I saw stole the breath from my lungs. Two men, both broad-shouldered and blank-faced, wearing matching beige landscaping uniforms, were standing just beyond my property line. Their hedge trimmers roared like beasts, the serrated blades twitching with anticipation. One of them revved his machine 3 times, the sound tearing through the morning air like a warning shot. But it was not the machines that truly unnerved me. It was Brenda. She stood across the street, arms crossed, back straight, the early sun catching the frost in her hair. She wore a pale yellow blouse and white slacks, pristine as always, and sunglasses that glinted like mirrors. Her mouth was fixed in something between a smile and a sneer. She did not move, did not wave, did not speak. She just watched, as if she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. I bolted for the door, my coffee cup crashing to the floor behind me, the sharp crack of ceramic on tile barely registered. "Hey!" I shouted, stepping off the porch, barefoot on the cold concrete. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The trimmers screamed to life. Branches began to fall, chunks of green, thick and healthy, sheared off in violent bursts. They did not trim, they butchered. Limbs the size of my forearm fell with dull, fleshy thuds onto the earth. Leaves scattered like panicked birds. In seconds, years of growth were reduced to mulch. I stumbled forward, hands raised, heart pounding. "This is my property," I shouted. "You cannot do this." One of the men glanced at me, impassive behind dark glasses. He held up a clipboard, the paper fluttering in the wind. "HOA directive, sir," he said flatly. I snatched the paper. The ink was fresh. Brenda's signature at the bottom. No hearing, no notice, no appeal, just action. "Remove them entirely," it read. "Failure to comply will result in continued fines and further action." My hedges were not being trimmed to 7 feet. They were being exterminated. I looked at Brenda. She had not moved. Only her lips curled slightly as if savoring the destruction. "You stood there," I called to her, "and watched them ruin 20 years of care." 20 years! She removed her sunglasses, just for a moment. "They were non-compliant, Mr. Vance," she said, voice calm and clear across the street. "The HOA had no choice. No choice. As if she were some unwilling participant, some neutral enforcer of fairness. But her eyes betrayed her, cold, bright with triumph. She had wanted this. Not compliance, not order, not sunlight for her roses. She wanted domination. The machines roared louder, the branches fell faster. They moved with terrifying efficiency, carving through hedge after hedge like surgeons with a vendetta. I shouted again. No one heard me. The sound of metal tearing through wood drowned out everything, even my own thoughts. I stood there as the last wall of green crumbled. And then silence. The machines stopped. The landscapers gathered the debris into large bins, tossing the remnants of my sanctuary like garbage. My hedges, those proud, stoic guardians, were reduced to splinters and dust. What remained were stumps, jagged and raw, barely 2 feet tall. The earth around them looked torn, like battlefield soil. The sun hit my house differently now. Harsh, direct, unforgiving. I turned to look at the living room window. For the first time in decades, I could see directly into my own home from the street. There was nothing left between me and them. The privacy I had cultivated so carefully had been torn away in under 20 minutes. And still, Brenda watched. She turned slowly and walked back to her porch. Not a word, not a glance, just the satisfied air of a monarch whose orders had been carried out to perfection. I stepped into the dirt, into the scarred soil where my hedges once stood, bent down, touched one of the stumps. The bark, once soft and waxy, was now cracked and bleeding sap. I ran my hand across the surface, then pulled it away. Splinters dug into my skin. I did not flinch. I felt hollow. Not sad, not furious, just emptied. But in that hollowness, something stirred. It was not the fiery rage you see in films, not the impulsive scream of a man wronged. It was slower, deeper. It crawled up from somewhere I had long sealed off. A chill, a shift. Something cold and calculated began to form in the silence. I turned slowly, scanning the street, the sidewalks, the neatly clipped lawns. Everything so orderly, so smug, as if it had won. And then my eyes landed on Brenda's garden. The roses, her pride, now bathed in sunlight, stood erect and blooming, crimson petals trembling in the breeze. She had her victory. She had carved out her perfection. But perfection is fragile. I stood there, rooted to the dirt, long after the landscapers had driven away, long after Brenda disappeared inside. The afternoon sun glared down on the bare strip of earth that had once been green and alive. A strange image entered my mind, not of hedges, not of plants at all, but of stone, of something taller, thicker, colder, a wall, a fortress, not to beautify, but to block, not to decorate, but to defend. That night, I did not sleep. I sat at the kitchen table, the ruined yard outside my window, and I planned. Not in anger, but in clarity. Brenda Carmichael had declared war. She just had no idea who she was fighting. The landscapers left behind more than a mangled yard. They left a battlefield. My once pristine lawn was littered with fragments of what had stood guard for 2 decades. Branches crushed under tire tracks, root balls half exposed and gasping for soil, clumps of dark earth scattered like shell craters. The hedges were gone, but their ghosts lingered, silent, shredded reminders of what had been. I stood in the wreckage until the light began to fade. The sky turned a burnt orange as the sun dropped behind Brenda's house, casting long shadows across my gutted yard. For the first time since I had moved to Cypress Creek, I could see clear across the street, and I hated it. I hated how exposed it made me feel, how unprotected. My living room window, once swaddled in soft green light, now glared with the full force of the afternoon sun. There was no more buffer between my solitude and the neighborhood's watchful eyes. No more sanctuary, just me, the dirt, and the silence. That night, I did not turn on the lights. I sat in the dark, a glass of water untouched on the table, staring out through the open blinds. Brenda's porch light flicked on at precisely 7. She emerged minutes later in a housecoat the color of over-bleached bone, carrying her metal watering can. I watched her move methodically, tending to her roses like they were royalty. She bent low, whispered to them as if they were alive. Maybe they were, in her world. She never looked my way, but she did not need to. Her message had already been delivered. This was not about bylaws. It never had been. It was about control and territory and power dressed up in the language of order. She had not trimmed my hedges. She had eradicated them, decapitated them, rooted them out with surgical precision. And in doing so, she had violated something I had thought untouchable, my peace. But grief, I have learned, is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, cold, focused. I remembered that from when Claire died. The world had expected me to fall apart, but I had not. I had buried myself in work, in archives, in the silence of the stacks. People called it strength. It was not. It was simply a refusal to be seen unraveling. Now, that same cold calm returned. Not despair, not rage, strategy. I walked out into the yard the next morning with a notebook in one hand and a measuring tape in the other. The sun was already high, the dirt still damp where the hedges had bled into the earth. I paced the perimeter of the former green wall, marking corners, jotting down dimensions, sketching rough outlines in pencil. My mind worked methodically. What could not be trimmed? What could not be touched by HOA clippers or Brenda's smug authority? Not plants, stone, a wall, something permanent, unyielding, uncompromising, not a decorative picket fence, not a trellis, a structure, a line that could not be crossed, a fortress. It started as a fantasy, born of spite. But the more I considered it, the more it took shape. Cinder blocks, concrete, a height of 8 feet, just under the municipal limit for unpermitted residential walls. It would block Brenda's view, block her Rose's sunlight, block the neighborhood's sense of entitlement to my private life. I was not building to beautify. I was building to reclaim. That afternoon, I pulled out the city ordinances. Years of working in archives had made me fluent in bureaucratic language. I combed through zoning codes, fencing regulations, architectural guidelines. I cross-referenced HOA covenants, printed out bylaws, highlighted contradictions. A loophole emerged. The HOA had rigid rules for landscaping, maximum heights, approved plant lists, mandatory setbacks. But when it came to permanent structures, they deferred to city building codes. Masonry walls were not even mentioned in the HOA handbook, only wood, vinyl, or decorative wrought iron. Anything else fell under municipal jurisdiction. And the city allowed non-load-bearing masonry walls up to 8 feet in height, as long as they stayed within the property line and met basic safety standards. Brenda had spent years memorizing the HOA playbook, but this next move would not be played on her board. By dusk, my table was buried in blueprints, building supply catalogs, printed forums on DIY foundations. My notebook was filling with calculations, material weight, spacing for rebar, mortar drying times. I watched videos on cinder block installation, rewatched them, made notes in the margins. I compared prices from local suppliers, checked delivery options. I did not sleep much that night either. The next morning, I drove to the city planning department under a different name. Hypothetically, I asked the clerk behind the counter, if a homeowner wanted to build a cinder block wall along their front yard. As long as it is under 8 feet and within your setback requirements, you're probably fine, she said, barely glancing up. Just make sure you don't build into the easement, and don't connect it to any load-bearing structures and permits. Not required below 8 feet if it is decorative or non-load-bearing, but you are responsible for making sure it is safe. That was enough for me. When I got home, I stood again in the raw space where the hedges had once been. My boots pressed into the soft dirt, leaving fresh impressions where roots used to anchor my world. The ground still smelled of chlorophyll and diesel and death. But in my mind, I could already see the wall, course by course, block by block, not gray and lifeless, but strong, steadfast, a statement. Not of anger, of autonomy. This was not retaliation, this was reclamation. Brenda had stripped me of privacy, so I would build something she could never prune, and this time, I would not ask for permission. It began with a phone call. After days spent buried in zoning ordinances and structural regulations, I needed one final confirmation. Not from the HOA, that ship had long since sunk, but from the city. I dialed the planning department, my notes spread out like a war map across the dining table. "Good morning," said a bored-sounding woman. "Planning and zoning, how can I help you?" "I'm a homeowner," I began, keeping my voice measured, "looking to build a privacy wall along the front of my property. I've reviewed the code, but I want to double-check. 8 feet is the maximum allowable height for a masonry structure without a permit, correct?" She hesitated only a second before answering. "Yes, that's correct. As long as it's not load-bearing, stays within your property line, and doesn't obstruct city utilities or easements, no permit is required. And the material cinder block? Allowed. And the HOA?" I asked carefully. "Do they override city codes?" She almost laughed. "No. HOA rules apply internally, but for permanent structures, especially masonry, the city's code supersedes HOA guidelines. They can suggest, but they can't enforce." That was it. My opening. I hung up, exhaled slowly, and looked out at the raw, open strip of land that had once cradled my hedges. The ground still bore their shadow, but not for long. That afternoon, I submitted an order. 2 pallets of standard gray cinder blocks, 4 bags of cement mix, 30 lengths of rebar, and enough sand to level a foundation worthy of a castle wall. It arrived 2 days later. The first truck came early, its diesel engine rumbling like distant thunder. I stood on the porch as the flatbed reversed down my cul-de-sac, the entire street awakening to the sharp hiss of brakes and the hydraulic groan of the liftgate. Block by block, the delivery men stacked my ammunition. Each one thudded into place with a kind of deliberate finality, like punctuation in a language Brenda did not yet speak. Then came the cement mixer, smaller, portable, but equally defiant. Bags of sand, rebar bundles, buckets, gloves, a level, stakes. It looked less like a home improvement project and more like a siege. And perhaps it was. Neighbors paused their morning routines. Mr. Jenkins, still in his robe, stopped mid-sip of his coffee. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson watched with a wrinkled brow and a silent wave. No one asked what I was building. They knew. I set everything up slowly, methodically. Not because I wanted to make a scene, but because I wanted the message to settle. This was not an act of landscaping. This was a statement. By noon, the cinder blocks lined my front yard like soldiers awaiting deployment. They formed a clean, orderly line where once there had been green chaos. The sun beat down on their surface, casting harsh, unwavering shadows. There was no softness in concrete, no room for trimming or taming. It was permanent, unapologetic, and then, as if on cue, she emerged. Brenda Carmichael stepped onto her porch like a queen surveying a rebellion. Her eyes found the blocks instantly. She froze. Her carefully sculpted expression wavered. For the first time, I saw something unfamiliar behind her sunglasses. Uncertainty. She crossed the street in a fury of perfume and pressed linen. Her heels clicked sharply against the pavement. She stopped just at the edge of my property, careful not to cross the invisible line that now might as well have been carved in stone. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice tight with control. "What is the meaning of this?" I looked up from the rebar I was measuring. "Meaning of what, Brenda?" She gestured with both arms, as if the act of pointing made her case stronger. "This wall, these blocks, this monstrosity, a privacy wall," I replied calmly. 8 feet, within code, confirmed with the city. "You're building a wall? Here, in front of your house?" "I no longer have hedges," I said, brushing the dust from my palms. "I need privacy. You removed one barrier. I am building another." Her lips parted in disbelief. "This is an eyesore. It will devalue the neighborhood." I let the accusation hang in the air before answering. "Like a chainsawed stump field?" I asked, voice level. "Or like destroying 20 years of mature landscaping because a rose garden needed more sun?" She did not respond. "I checked the HOA covenants," I continued. "They mention fences. Wood, vinyl, iron, but no masonry, no walls. That makes this a city matter. And the city says I'm well within my rights." Brenda stared at me, and for a long, delicious moment, she was utterly speechless. Her world, so carefully maintained through rulebooks and signatures and intimidation, had a crack in its foundation. And I had found it. She tried to recover. This will never pass architectural review. There is no review for walls, I said. Only for fences. I pointed to the outline I had staked with twine and markers. It's on my land, within height, non-load-bearing, and it cannot be trimmed. That last line was not just for her. It was for me. Brenda turned without another word, but the stiffness in her spine, the sudden tremble in her hand as she adjusted her sunglasses. It was all I needed. The fortress had not yet risen, but the battle had already shifted. That evening, as I mixed the first batch of mortar beneath the fading light, I felt a calm I had not known in weeks. The cinder blocks were cold, heavy, and stubborn, just like me, and for the first time, I no longer felt defenseless. There is a rhythm to building, not the mechanical repetition of labor, but something older, ancient almost. It settles into your bones, into your muscles, into your breath. Mix, lay level, rest, repeat. I had once handled rare manuscripts with gloved fingers. Now, I handled rough stone and wet mortar. And somehow, the shift felt natural. Each morning, I tied on worn work gloves and stirred the concrete by hand, watching the dust bloom into substance. My fingers, once nimble and pale, grew calloused and stiff. I kept the water ratio precise, the measurements clean, the blocks aligned within millimeters. Librarian habits die hard. I worked in silence. No music, no podcast. Just the scrape of trowel against bucket, the low churning of the cement mixer, the solid thunk of block against block. And I found peace there. I had not felt it since Claire passed. It surprised me, the comfort I found in labor, not in defiance or revenge, but in order. Each row of blocks brought structure back to something that had been taken from me. Brenda had thought she could unravel me by stripping away my sanctuary, but she had only revealed what lay beneath. A man who still knew how to build, a man who had never truly surrendered to stillness, only chosen it. I kept a meticulous log of the construction, not out of paranoia, but preparation. Every course I laid, I documented. I photographed the footing, the rebar placement, the leveling process. I stored receipts in plastic folders, labeled by date and supplier. I was no engineer, but I was thorough, and thorough, I had learned, was its own kind of power. The wall rose steadily. By the end of the second week, it reached waist. Height. That was when the neighbors started noticing, not just glancing through curtains, but noticing. One morning, I found a cold bottle of lemonade resting on my porch railing. No note, just a quiet gesture. The next day, a Tupperware of brownies. Then, a pair of heavy-duty gloves in a plastic bag, the tag still attached. Mrs. Henderson from 2 doors down gave me a knowing smile when I waved. Even Mr. Jenkins, apron stained with grill smoke, gave me a thumbs up one evening and simply said, "Looks solid, Art." I did not seek their approval, but I felt it all the same. They had watched me get humiliated, and now they were watching me respond, not with lawsuits or shouting, but with something stronger. Brick. Brenda's surveillance intensified. She began patrolling in her golf cart again, always alone, always slow, always lingering just long enough for her presence to register. She started parking across the street for long stretches of time, phone in hand, eyes never blinking. Twice I saw her take photos. I ignored her. Let her watch, let her record. She was documenting her own unraveling. The true escalation came on a Friday afternoon. I had just finished setting the 6th course when a black sedan pulled up outside. The HOA emblem on the door glinted in the sunlight like a badge of misplaced authority. Brenda stepped out first, behind her. Mr. Davies, soft-voiced, always nervously adjusting his glasses. And Mrs. Gable, a woman who spoke only in agreements and tight-lipped nods. Brenda carried a manila folder under one arm. Her lips were pressed into a line so thin, it nearly disappeared. "Mr. Vance," she began, marching up to the edge of my property. "We need to talk." I removed my gloves slowly and leaned against a stack of blocks. "I figured this was coming," I said, wiping sweat from my brow. She opened the folder like a magician, preparing to reveal her trick. The HOA board has passed an emergency amendment. Effective immediately, all exterior constructions exceeding 4 feet in height must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee. She held out the document like a warrant. I did not take it. Effective immediately, I repeated. Yes. I nodded slowly. And when was this amendment passed? Last night. Emergency session. I let the silence stretch, then asked, and does it apply retroactively? Brenda's jaw clenched. That is for the committee to determine. No, I said calmly. That is for the city to determine. And the city recognizes the start of physical construction as the legal commencement of a structure. I stepped aside, gesturing toward the rebar already anchored, the first several rows already mortared in place. This wall began construction 8 days ago. I have photographic proof, time-stamped receipts, even the cement delivery invoice from your favorite supplier down on Halston Avenue. I finally took the folder and flipped it open. The language was sloppy, rushed, vague. It was not a rule, it was a panic button. You are grasping, Brenda, I said, and it is obvious. Mr. Davies shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Gable stared at the cracks in my driveway like they held the secrets to the universe. Brenda tried to speak, but I held up a hand. You destroyed my hedges without consent, without legal grounds. You violated my privacy, my property, and my peace. I responded by building something within the law. You cannot punish me now simply because I did not break. Her cheeks flushed crimson. This is not about punishment, she snapped. This is about maintaining visual harmony in our neighborhood. Your wall is industrial. It is an eyesore. It is antagonistic industrial, I repeated, letting the word roll on my tongue. Like dragging a diesel trimmer across someone's front yard and calling it landscaping. Like erasing 2 decades of growth with one signature. She took a breath, then faltered. This was her limit. She was used to residents folding at the first letter, crumbling under the weight of bylaws and peer pressure. But I had studied systems longer than she had ruled them, and I was not playing defense anymore. She spun on her heel, her heels clicking like angry metronomes. We will revisit this, she said over her shoulder. I watched them retreat to the sedan, the HOA, seal catching the sun one final time before disappearing around the corner. The next day I laid the 7th course, block by block, mortar by mortar, steady, unshaken. I was not a builder by trade, but now I was building something more than a wall. I was building my line in the sand, and behind it, I would not move. The invitation arrived via email, though I doubt they ever expected me to accept it. HOA special session, community discussion on recent events. No mention of my name, no mention of Brenda's either. Just recent events, like someone had accidentally overwatered the azaleas. I did not attend. The wall was already 6 feet high by then. I had finished the corner posts and was preparing to install decorative caps. A touch of irony, perhaps, to crown the monument to their humiliation. But that email, vague and pitiful, confirmed what I already knew. Brenda was losing control. She had pulled every lever she could reach. Emergency ordinances, HOA amendments, architectural review boards stacked with sycophants. And none of them had stopped me, because none of them had the reach she thought they did. She had built her empire on whispers and intimidation. But mine was built on concrete, and now the balance had shifted. My first act of quiet defiance was a sign, a simple wooden plank, painted white with block letters in black. No trespassing, private property, cameras in use. I staked it just inside the boundary, exactly 12 inches from the sidewalk. Within city code, of course. Then I mounted 2 solar-powered motion cameras on either end of the wall. They were not hidden. That was the point. The next morning, I watched through the monitor as Brenda's golf cart rolled to a stop across the street. She sat there for almost 5 minutes, staring at the sign. She did not speak. She did not smile. She simply tapped the side of her cart with a pen, over and over and over again. And then she drove away. Later that week, the letters started, not certified, not official. Just small white envelopes tucked neatly into my mailbox. The first was about the unauthorized storage of construction materials. The second cited disruption to neighborhood aesthetic balance. The third accused me of unauthorized modification of front yard drainage. And the fourth, my favorite, warned me of improper flag height on the American flag I had placed temporarily in the dirt near the wall. Each one came with a friendly tone. Please address the following minor violation within 3 business days to avoid formal notice. They were not about violations. They were about control. Brenda's war had gone tactical. She could no longer stop the wall, so she would nibble at the edges, trying to make the process so unbearably tedious I would simply stop building. But that was where she miscalculated. I thrive in tedium. The thing about being a librarian, especially one who specializes in municipal archives, is that you learn to operate inside bureaucracy. You learn how to file things, how to track correspondence, how to document without error or omission. So, I responded to each letter with a printed reply, signed and dated, including photo evidence and relevant city ordinances. I filed each original envelope into a binder labeled Brenda. Her next move was surveillance. She began appearing on my block 2, sometimes 3 times a day. Sometimes alone, sometimes with her community standards subcommittee. They always walked slowly, taking notes, whispering, sometimes pointing directly at my wall. Once I saw Brenda take out a tape measure and stretch it across the grass, muttering something to Mrs. Gable, who nodded solemnly, as if recording the dimensions of a war crime. I pretended not to notice, but I installed a third camera anyway. This one faced the sidewalk directly. The red light blinked with quiet precision, like the eye of something mechanical and very patient. The wall reached its final height on a Wednesday morning, 8 feet, perfectly level, smooth mortar seams, reinforced posts at each edge. I swept the sidewalk, washed the tools, and took one final photograph from the middle of the street. It was not beautiful, but it was undeniable, solid, lawful, untouchable. That night, as dusk fell, I stood behind the wall and listened to the quiet. No hedge trimmers, no neighborhood meetings, no barking directives from across the street. Only the sound of wind pressing softly against the blocks. I did not celebrate. I just stood there, palms resting on the cool concrete, letting the silence settle. But Brenda. A did not stop. The next wave came in the form of courtesy notices. One accused me of having visible construction debris, a single bag of unused sand tucked neatly behind my garage. Another pointed out unapproved garden edging, a row of stones I had placed to separate grass from gravel. She even cited excessive water use during one particularly hot day when I rinsed my tools for 15 minutes. The fines were small, $10 here, $25 there. But they stacked like bricks, one after another. She was trying to wear me down, death by paperwork. But here is what she did not understand. I had lived through a real death, the slow one, the kind that erases a person inch by inch until they fade quietly into a hospital bed, surrounded by machines and apologies. After you watch that kind of ending, you stop fearing the small stuff. You stop fearing confrontation. You stop fearing people like Brenda Carmichael. So I built another binder, this one labeled Nuisance Citations. I filed them all, replied to everyone, documented it all, and I waited for her next misstep. And then, she made it, a letter, sent not to me, but to every homeowner on Hawthorne Lane. HOA Directive, 7B Neighborhood Harmony Initiative. Under it, Brenda proposed a clause that required community aesthetic review for all exterior changes, retroactive for up to 90 days. The language was sloppy, illegal even. She overstepped, and this time, someone else noticed. 2 neighbors filed complaints, one anonymously, the other. Mr. Jenkins attached his name. I received a copy of the complaint by accident. Someone slid it into my mailbox, unsigned. The complaint accused Brenda of abusing her position to settle personal vendettas. It listed my wall as the catalyst, but also cited previous incidents. Her attempts to penalize a young couple for using non-regulation mulch. Her threats to fine a retired teacher for putting up wind chimes. The tide had turned. She had not just lost her authority, she had exposed her obsession. And the wall, my wall, stood tall, cold, unmoved. a monument to quiet resistance. The city envelope was heavier than I expected. It arrived in a thick manila pouch with my full name typed in block letters, the kind of letter that came not with suggestion, but consequence. No return address, no softening salutation, just a blunt directive from the Department of Planning and Zoning. Cease and desist, unauthorized masonry structure. My breath caught as I read the details. According to an anonymous complaint, though I needed no help guessing the source, my wall was being reviewed for potential violation of municipal safety codes. The report cited possible structural risk, failure to file appropriate engineering plans, and suspicion of uninspected foundation depth and improper rebar installation. It was thorough. Too thorough. Someone had gone to great lengths to phrase this just right, to sound official while burying the knife under a pillow of concern. It was bureaucratic warfare, and it had Brenda Carmichael's perfume all over it. I set the letter down on the table and stared at the wall outside my window. 8 feet tall, 32 feet long, a monument to patience. Now, potentially, a liability. That night, I did not eat. I sat at the kitchen table with the lights off, the envelope still in front of me. Brenda had played her last card, and it was a good one. This was not a HOA citation I could swat away. This was city jurisdiction. This meant inspectors, permits, maybe fines, maybe demolition. For the first time in weeks, I felt the walls inside me crack. Not from fear, from weariness. I was tired of waking up early to lay mortar, tired of responding to citation letters, tired of Brenda's shadow sliding across my front lawn every morning like a snake looking for cracks. For a moment, I imagined surrender, tearing the wall down, letting them win, letting the world go back to its uniform little order while I disappeared into the background again. But then, I remembered the bags. They were still in the garage. I had saved them without knowing why. The torn concrete mix bags, folded neatly, stacked by date, batch numbers, manufacturer, ratings, and the photographs. All of them. From the day I broke ground. Each stage, each measurement. I remembered a line I had read in the city code while cross-referencing structures under 8 feet in non-load-bearing contexts. If material integrity and construction methods can be demonstrated through sufficient documentation, a waiver may be granted upon inspector discretion. It had seemed like a footnote then. Now, it felt like a lifeline. By midnight, I had everything spread out across the floor. Photos, invoices, diagrams, rebar lengths, mix ratios. The empty bags of concrete, clearly labeled. Even receipts from the local supplier showing the dates and weight of each pallet delivered. I labeled each item with sticky notes, grouped them by construction phase, and slid them all into a binder. It was not perfect, but it was something. And it was mine. The inspector arrived 2 mornings later. Mr. Harrison, tall, quiet, graying at the temples. He stepped out of his city vehicle with a clipboard tucked under one arm and wore a neutral expression that betrayed nothing. "Mr. Vance?" he asked. "Yes," I said, stepping forward. "I believe you're here about the wall." He nodded and scanned the structure from base to cap. Then his eyes found mine. "I understand this was constructed without permits." I held up the binder. "That's correct. But I believe I fall within exemption code for structures under 8 feet in height, not connected to any load-bearing property, and constructed with non-combustible materials. I've documented every stage of construction, including materials, depth, reinforcement, and alignment." He took the binder without a word and flipped it open. We walked the perimeter together. I showed him where the rebar had been tied, showed him a small patch I had left uncovered near the base, exposing the depth of the foundation. I showed him the batch numbers on the cement bags, the date stamps on the photos, the level of the final capstone. For the next half hour, he said very little, just took notes, measured, knocked on the blocks, ran his hand over the mortar lines. Finally, he closed the binder with a soft clap and looked at me. "Documentation is solid," he said. I did not breathe. "Construction appears compliant with all structural requirements for a non-load-bearing wall under 8 feet, he continued. "Foundation is deep enough, rebar placement is consistent. Material integrity is verifiable. I nodded slowly, unable to speak. He turned to face me squarely. I will submit this for final review. I see no reason this structure should be considered in violation. Then he paused, and his gaze drifted across the street. Brenda stood there, watering her roses. She was not pretending today. Her eyes were locked on us, her hands white-knuckled around the metal can. Her mouth was pressed tight, her jaw rigid with disbelief. Mr. Harrison looked back at me. "One more thing," he said. I waited. "We've had several complaints from your HOA regarding this property. Some exaggerated, possibly retaliatory. If I were you, I'd document those too." I nodded. "I already have," I said quietly. He smiled just a little. "Smart man." He turned, walked to his vehicle, and drove off without another word. I stood in the yard for a long time after he left. The wall stood tall behind me, casting its shadow long across the lawn. It no longer felt like a protest. It felt like a monument to patience, to persistence, to the simple, stubborn belief that the quiet ones are never as fragile as they seem. Across the street, Brenda disappeared into her house. Her curtain did not move for the rest of the day. And for the first time in months, I felt the air shift. Not in anger, but in peace. The wall still stands. It does not speak. It does not demand attention. It simply is. A silent sentinel of concrete and rebar, stretched across the boundary where green once lived. People pass by it every day now. Some slow down, their eyes drawn to the clean lines and cool surface. Some nod. A few even smile. No one calls it an eyesore anymore. Brenda does not speak of it. Not since the morning Mr. Harrison delivered his final report to the HOA in writing, formally acknowledging the wall as compliant, sound, and fully within city code. The city added a quiet postscript, a warning against frivolous or retaliatory complaints, a single sentence, no names. But everyone knew. Brenda has not sent another notice since. The wall changed more than just the view from my porch. It changed the power dynamic. The curtain she once twitched to surveil has stayed closed for weeks. The roses still bloom, but she waters them less. Sometimes silence is not surrender. Sometimes it is acknowledgement. I still walk the length of the wall every morning. I check the mortar, test the cameras, brush off the leaves that collect at its base. It is not just stone. It is memory, effort, boundary, not the kind built to shut the world out, but to keep dignity in. Last week I was walking the sidewalk when Mrs. Henderson stopped me. She held out a paper plate with 2 lemon squares wrapped in foil. "For your fort," she said softly, then leaned closer. "Good for you, Arthur." I did not need the sweets, but I took them anyway. Later that night, I sat in my living room, no blinds, no fear, and watched the street through the clean glass. The lamps along Hawthorne Lane cast soft halos on the pavement. The breeze shifted through the branches of the maple tree overhead, and the wall stood, gray and resolute, bathed in moonlight. I thought of Claire, of how she used to say, "Privacy is not the absence of people, it's the presence of peace." For years I mistook silence for defeat. But peace can be loud too. Sometimes it looks like brick and concrete. Sometimes it looks like a man who refused to back down. Brenda may never apologize. She may never admit she lost. But she knows. She sees it every day, and so do I. That is enough. The tables have turned. Have you ever had to prove your worth in silence? Share your story below. We're listening.